I know that there's a few students who are yet to be joining us, but conscious of the fact that it is 2 p.m, I do want to kick off the session for today. So firstly, and most importantly, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see so many students committed to joining us every day at 2 p.m. to learn a little bit more about different kind of brands and companies that we're working with, but not only that, but learning some more key employability skills and how you can clear yourselves up a bit more about different kind of elements of the working world. And today it's really going to focus on the application process. So we're lucky enough to be joined by some special guests who I'm going to let introduce themselves a little bit later. But ultimately, the aim of today's session is that you'll leave today's session getting a bit more of an understanding around what are assessment centres, what are interviews. You might know the answer to those questions already, but just a few kind of top tips from an employer partner around those different elements of the application process and how you can kind of ace them when you get to that stage in the future of applying. So yeah, thank you so much for joining. I'm Ellie from Pathway CTM and you've got Catherine from Pathway CTM here for the session today. So thanks for joining us and that's what today's session is really going to consist of. In terms of an agenda, then as I mentioned just now, then we're going to be looking at assessment centres and interviews, are kind of top tips from a Pathway CTM side, and a bit of an overview in terms of what those two things are, and also following the introduction, some top tips and some expert opinions from the ed broking side. So we're really lucky to be joined by them today. So that gives you a rough agenda. I know Emanuela asked us this question earlier, but when it comes to timing, it will be roughly 45 minutes to an hour session based on the questions, volume of questions coming through. So don't worry, we'll try not to leave any questions unanswered. So that gives you an idea in terms of the rough agenda of today. So talking of questions, how do you do that? How do you ask questions? How do you get the most out of today's session? So there's really a few ways you can use this Zoom webinar function to ask and get the most out of today's session. You can either write in the chat box, so where we've seen Catherine's written in to enjoy the session, guys, and you can write any comments that you have into that chat box, just like PJ sent us a hello and Emanuela asked us that great question. So that's the chat box, but really if you do have any kind of formal questions or questions throughout the session, then do your best to kind of direct those to the Q&A box, because then we can keep a track of them. Catherine and I will always have our eye on the Q&A box, so we can have a look and see throughout the whole session on any questions that you have coming in. So, you know, we really encourage you to do that. Do ask questions, do make comments, because really that's why we're here. That's why you're using your 2 to 3 p.m. on a Monday to be with us at Pathway, is just to learn a little bit more and get some answers to your questions. So do anything that comes into your head. There's no silly question, write it into the Q&A box. And just to be clear on that, you're not interrupting us. So if we move on to the next section of today and we're doing introductions, then don't worry if you have a question throughout that, just pop it in the Q&A box and we'll get to it when there's an appropriate time. So don't hold back, just ask the question when it comes to you. That's perfect time actually, because I've seen Walaya just raised their hand. So that's another kind of function you can use on Zoom. So if you do have any questions that are burning or you want to raise our attention, raise your hand like Walaya just did, so I can see that in the corner of my eye, and then pop any questions in the Q&A box or the chat box. So Walaya, do pop anything in there if you have any questions for us at this stage. So that's kind of the practicalities of today's session. Like I mentioned, you've got Catherine and I from a Pathway CTM side, and we also have a few special guests from the ed broking side. And I think that rather than me introducing you, then we're in a really good position for you to kind of introduce yourselves. So we've got a couple of those listed on the introduction section here with us today. So maybe Sheena first, do you mind giving us a quick kind of overview in terms of who you are and what your role is at ed broking?
Certainly, that's no problem. I'm Sheena Lilly. I've been at ed broking now for 5 years, working on their marine insurance department. I'm a broker there, so quite old-fashioned up until the lockdown. Go over to Lloyd's of London to place insurance policies on behalf of our clients. yeah,
That's
that's sort of
amazing.
me in a nutshell.
Yeah, perfect. And then Flora, I know we have you dialed in on the line as well. Do you mind giving us a quick overview in terms of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, of course. I'm Flora McCain, and I am an HR officer within the HR department at Ed. So my job is to sort of look after all of our employees. They are my clients, and check everyone's sort of happy. And I do a lot of recruitment as part of my role. So a lot of onboarding and offboarding when people leave our job as well. And yeah, just general sort of day-to-day of checking that employees are okay and things to do with their employment.
Absolutely, that's great. And I think we'll definitely have loads of questions from the students then in terms of that kind of onboarding and recruitment side of things, definitely for you, Flora. Sheena, just before we move on, do you mind giving us, maybe for the benefit of some of those students who might not necessarily know who Ed Broking are or what they do? I know you touched upon that a little bit with what your role is, but is there any chance you could just give us a really quick overview in terms of like, what do Ed Broking do? What is the company? What do you do?
Certainly. So Ed Broking, we're an insurance broker. We cover a whole range of classes of insurance. Obviously, until I fell into this job, my experience of insurance was very much your car insurance or your house insurance. And when I started working at Ed, it opened up a whole new avenue for the whole range of different insurance areas that you can become involved with. So Ed Broking, like I say, we have cover a lot of classes. We have an energy division, which deals with all the oil and gas, mining, etc. like that. We've got property, which again is commercial property rather than your household insurance. We have a large reinsurance department, so that's where you cover the people covering your insurance, if you like. We're insuring the underwriters. We've got offices, Flora, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we've got 6 overseas offices spread around the key areas in the world for insurance, though London is still very much our head. And up until very recently, obviously, the insurance market generally has been centred around Lloyd's. So it's the square mile, if anyone's heard of it. It's the square mile, which is where the vast majority of the insurance brokers and underwriters have traditionally been sort of set up, and that was largely because of Lloyd's of London. It was still very much a case of you walk over to Lloyd's with your slips. I won't go into too much detail, but hopefully some of you got a vague idea of what I'm talking about, to arrange those insurances on behalf of our clients.
That's great, thank you so much. And I think that'll be really helpful for some of the students maybe who might not necessarily know much about the industry, which is absolutely fine, students. So that gives us a really good idea. And I guess off the back of that then, from Catherine and I at Pathway, then we're so grateful to have both of you on the line who throughout the main content of the session can really kind of give us a bit of some top tips in terms of, you've definitely been through the process yourselves, maybe, and Flora, you're sitting on the other side of it sometimes through the kind of early years recruitment side of things. So just to give the students a bit of an idea, you've had the introductions now in terms of who's with us, and how this is really going to work is Catherine and I are going to work through some really key elements of the application process in general, not specifically at the Ed Broking kind of application process, but what we're really going to do is then reach out to Sheena and Flora, and just from maybe personal experience or from an Ed Broking application process perspective, ask them around those different elements of the application process, what top tips they might have from their own personal experience, or from sitting and being part of the early careers from Flora's perspective. So that's really how it's going to work today. So thank you for that introduction there, and a bit of an idea of who we have on the line. So without kind of further ado, then I'm going to kick off first by talking a little bit about assessment centres as a whole. So I really want to see some of the students engaging with us today. So can anyone in the chat box maybe, and don't worry if you don't want to share, that's absolutely fine, but if anyone has maybe done an assessment centre or know anything about an assessment centre, then pop it in the chat box. I'd be really interested to see if any of you have kind of been part of that process before. We'd love to hear. I know we have some kind of vocal, confident students which are always really engaged with us. So do pop it in the chat box if you have been to an assessment centre, to give us an idea. what are assessment centres then? That's a really important question, because the majority of you, if you're going to be going through the process of applying to a particular apprenticeship scheme or work experience scheme, you might face an assessment centre as a big part of the application process. So Jake, that's great to see that you've actually been in an assessment centre in the past, so you'll know what I'm talking about in the sense of practicalities. So what is an assessment centre? Largely, in terms of what an assessment centre is, it can vary from maybe a half day at the very minimum to a 2-day assessment centre. And what does it actually consist of? So often it's maybe 3 to 5 exercises throughout that period of time. So obviously if you've got a half day, and it's going to be quite close and succinct number of exercises in that half day, or maybe if it's 2 days, then you're going to have longer tasks over a period of time. And what you're really kind of being tested on is group tasks, how you work together in different groups. So that could be a problem-solving task, like many of you will have been on one of our problem-solving webinars over the past few weeks, where we go and break out into the smaller groups, work together and come back, work together as a group, concluding and coming to an answer as a group, and then coming back into the main group and feeding back. So that's very similar to what happens in the assessment centres, or an individual task. So whether you have to do a presentation or a written task. Often in some industries there is an element of role play, particularly for a particular industry. And as you can see, then other things that it could consist of is maybe an analytical case study potentially, or even some kind of mock interviews. So Flora, I'm going to ask you, when it comes to ed broking, is there an assessment centre, and if so, kind of what does that consist of?
So no is a short answer. We don't do any of those things, although they all sound great and all really good ways of seeing sort of if someone's right for a role. We currently do the more old-fashioned sort of sit-down interview with sort of predetermined questions, although obviously depending on how the interview goes, you often do end up sort of asking questions that you necessarily haven't planned before. But no, we don't do any sort of formal assessment.
That's absolutely fine, and it gives us a good idea, I guess, of the variety of different application processes there are. But I guess as part of maybe a group task, I wonder, maybe Sheena, from experience maybe, or from any applications you've done before, have you been put in that situation where you're being tested as part of a group, as part of as an application process, or is that something which wasn't tested initially in any part of the roles you've done before?
Well, funny enough, I would have been in exactly the same position as your students are now, in that I left school after my A-levels and my first job was in insurance. So I worked up at London, and we did do a half-day assessment, which was, as you point out here, I think there must have been around 10 to 15 students, all school leavers, turned up to do their assessment day. And I think it was for around 6 roles. And that was their particular A-level trainee scheme. So yes, I have done one before. I can't remember the details because it was some time ago, but yeah, it was exactly what you said. And it wasn't massively focused for that particular assessment day. It wasn't massively focused on sort of your prospective job. It was very much looking at, as you say, the group activities and you as an individual, and how you interact and how keen you came across and things like that, rather than for a particular role. That we did have interviews afterwards, but for the assessment day it was far more general.
Absolutely, and I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of what's being tested in those kind of group activities. So that kind of ties in really nicely to some of our top tips, which we've given from a pathway perspective. And really it reminds you of that point you just made, Sheena, which is they're not testing you and they don't expect you to come in on that day and be perfectly qualified for a job. What they really are testing you is, how do you work with other people? Are you authentic? So I'm just going to go through some of these top tips. So authenticity, I know it sounds like a big thing which may be quite daunting to students, but actually it's just saying be yourself. turn up on that day and interact with other people in the way that you feel is most natural to you, because as you would have kind of seen from some of our sessions previously around strengths, is that actually everyone's strengths can be quite different, but they can very much complement each other and complement working with other people. So do turn up and be yourself, because Flora, I'm sure you'll kind of agree with me here that if you are you're hiring someone, you want to be hiring the person that you interview, don't you? You don't want to hire them and then find out 2 months into them working with you that they're actually quite different to what you've seen within the application process. Is that right? I guess obviously not through the assessment centre, but do you think being yourself is quite key to in the assessment process, quite key to having a happy job career within the company?
Definitely. I think it's your worst nightmare when you interview someone and you offer them a job and then they turn up and they are completely different, or even slightly different than what they how they presented themselves in the interview. Because the people you work with, you spend a lot of time with, you often spend more time with them than you do with lots of your friends and family. So there's no point in trying to be someone else and not coming across as how you are. Obviously you're trying to sell yourself, but you're just doing yourself a disservice, I think, if you present yourself in a way that you couldn't sustain, because you're gonna have to keep that act up sort of Monday to Friday every week. So it just wouldn't work. So yes, definitely be yourself, be honest about your strengths and weaknesses, because people will find them out. So you're not really going to gain anything from pretending to be otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that point around, it's a bit exhausting, isn't it, if you have to play to your strengths, and it ties into maybe points 2 and 3, which on a more short-term basis is make sure you aren't too tired for that particular day. So do try and get a good night's sleep the night before, get some good rest, and make sure, albeit you are being yourself, but you're being your best version of yourself for those few hours that you are in the assessment centre, whether it's a half day or 2 days. You really want to make sure that through, rest in the evening before, or through water and whatever you're eating and drinking throughout those days, you really do try and keep your energy up and show the best reflection of yourself, because it is reasonably kind of stress-inducing environment. And what you want to do is you want to minimize as much as possible any kind of factors which you can help guide and make it as easy as possible for you. So do try and get a good rest and eat and drink well throughout that time. When it comes to actually the practicalities of the group tasks within an assessment centre, what we've got down here from a pathway side is really kind of try and ensure you do make a contribution to the session. And that's not saying that I can see some of you probably will see point number 4, which is saying make a good contribution, and point 6 saying try not to be too competitive, as sometimes they are a little bit slightly different points. But really you can make a great contribution to a group task without being over competitive and overshadowing anyone else in that group. So it really is a case of working together, listening to those other people in the groups. For many employers, and I'll probably extend this to Sheena in a second, maybe from experiences, that they're not necessarily looking for the loudest person in the group. They're not looking for the person who's gonna, without any consultation from the rest of the group, lead that group to success. It's much more about those kind of general skills and working together as a team. And I know you gave that example, Sheena, earlier of you being in that situation and then testing more general parts, but did you feel as though, I guess, as part of that, they're looking for people who are listening out, who are asking other people's opinions as part of the assessment centre group tasks?
Yeah, very much so. I think, like you say, from both my own experience and from an employer's point of view, you want to see strong leadership qualities, but you don't want to see one person dominating the whole event. The whole point of it is interaction with your team. We're in positions where in some roles we're leadership roles, in some roles, we've still got people to answer to, and you need to be able to get a good balance between those. So I think what you've said is very true, and it's very easy in that environment to feel that you need to make yourself heard more. But actually you could, if somebody else has come up with a good point, if you say that's a really great idea, I think we could do that and do this as well, that's going to be noticed. It's not just going to be okay, but we could do this better and better, to make yourself heard. You can acknowledge good ideas from other people, and traits like that will be noticed.
Absolutely. And I think it's that enthusiasm, like you say, as an example there, which is complimenting someone else and having a great idea. It shows that enthusiasm and commitment to the group effort by complimenting other people. So it's a really clever way of doing it. And I know that Catherine, maybe you've seen this as well, but as part of our group task that we've been doing recently, you do see students complimenting and even referencing other students in their answers to questions when they've fed back to the large group. And I think that that's really impressive, and that's a skill which I tell all the students on the line to use, is remember those students in your group's name, and referencing them and their strengths is really, really, really impressive from an employer perspective, because it shows that you've got that kind of emotional intelligence to listen to other people and kind of mention their strengths as well. So that's great. And that ties in quite nicely to points, top tips 8 and 9, which is it's a very difficult thing to do, but do try and enjoy it, because these assessment centre tasks, we completely understand it's quite a stressful environment, but really you can actually thrive in them. And when you're put to a task or a problem solving task, sometimes it is something you can really get your teeth into and work together as a group. And I think any positivity, even when people are kind of smiling, you feel that you're attracted to people who are feeding back to the group and really working collaboratively. And I think that you know, being engaging and trying to enjoy it does make that a little bit easier and comes across quite well to any kind of assessor. So we definitely recommend that. And also finally, I guess you've made it to the assessment centre, you've done very, very, very well to get to that point. So do kind of remember that you're doing well already, so try and enjoy the kind of success that you're having so far. I know it's very easy to say, but sometimes difficult to do. And those are our kind of key bits of advice when it comes to assessment centres. So maybe Catherine, enough from me, and maybe over to you to talk a little bit about the interviews.
Yeah, sure, definitely. Also, just to add on that, Ellie, if you're, you know, worried about not saying anything, with some of the interactive sessions that we've run recently, you know, you do have a time limit. So be the timekeeper, you know, keep everyone in check and just make sure, oh guys, we've got 5 minutes left. So don't be afraid to, you know, give yourself that role. But now moving on to the interviews. So perhaps let us know, guys, perhaps some of you, you know, have part-time jobs, so you might have done a face-to-face interview before. So we're going to be chatting through the 3 types of interviews that you might get. So there's the face-to-face, telephone and video. So with that face-to-face interview, you know, you want to, as Ellie said, with the assessment centre, you want to do everything you can to make sure you are the best that you can be. So easy as, you know, the night before, planning your route, you know, what train are you going to be getting? I remember speaking to an apprentice who said that he made sure that he got the train before the train he needed to get. So in case there was a delay, you know, he was making sure that he wasn't going to be late. Because those things, you know, we hate it when you miss a train and you're faffing. Like, I know myself, if I'm late, I hate it and I just panic. So make sure you leave with plenty of time to get there nice and early, so you can really be in the zone and be prepared. And I guess your interview starts, you know, as soon as you've entered that building. So when you're speaking to the receptionist, you know, you might have to ask them a question, be polite to everyone that you see. And how you come across, your presentation. I wonder, Flora, if you've, with your interviewing experience, have you ever interviewed someone who perhaps hasn't looked the part?
I think it's less often that someone doesn't look the part. I think maybe on the odd occasion someone hasn't. Maybe you can tell they haven't maybe made as much effort as they could have. I mean, you don't expect people to always wear, you know, a full suit, I guess, and it does depend on the position. We have lots of different positions, obviously, within our company, but I think you can tell that when someone hasn't maybe made the best effort diplomatically.
Yeah, and I guess so.
Yeah.
So yeah. And from your side, I guess, you know, obviously you don't want to judge anyone as soon as you first met them, but I guess would you sort of mark them down in that instance? You know, obviously first impressions, you've got to make sure that you do dress smart. And as Flora said, you haven't got to go out and buy a suit. Just make sure you're presentable, you know, clean shoes, your hair looks nice, all those little things which will help you come across well. But I guess, Flora, from your side, you know, would if someone was great, but perhaps they, didn't make the effort, would that mark them down?
I think if someone interviews really well and ticks lots of the other boxes, those are more important. Again, I think it would depend on what position they were coming in for and the level of experience, because I think those things are more expected if you were coming in for a junior or trainee role, because potentially, this is one of your first interviews, or you haven't worked in a central office before, so you don't understand maybe what's expected of you. But obviously, if it was someone who was meant to be quite experienced, had obviously had lots of other jobs before, I think that would probably mark them down more. But it's such an easy thing to do well. Like, as you said, if you just put on a clean shirt, brush your hair, then that's an area where before you've even spoken, you've come across well. So it's a silly thing to almost let that get in the way of a really good interview. But I wouldn't let it, if I thought someone interviewed really well, I wouldn't let it get in the way of them not getting the role. But it would be a shame for that to sort of be the mark against you. Yeah,
no, of course. And I guess, with interviews, you're bound to be nervous, and that is fine to feel the nerves. But it's just making sure that doesn't come across and it doesn't stop you from getting the role. So I guess, Flora, do you have any keen top tips on how you can fake confidence? So it might be that, perhaps you're just feeling a bit down and you're thinking, oh gosh, I don't know if I can get through this interview, but it's all about the mindset, turning that around, getting in the zone. Any advice to the students on how they can fake confidence as such, so they're prepared and ready for the interview?
Good question. I think what Ellie was saying before is, often, I know certainly I get sent lots of CVs when I do recruitment. So if we are interviewing for someone, it is because we like the look of your CV. So trying to take that as a positive, that, companies don't often have a lot of time. So if they are inviting you in for an interview, that is because they do like you, so they do like the sound of you. So sort of use that to your advantage. Because they're not going to invite everyone who applies in for the role. And I think you probably feel more confident if you've done the research on the company and you've properly sat and thought about why you want the role, and sort of thought about the sort of questions that someone's going to put to you, so you have some answers to hand. I think the more preparation you do, definitely helps with nerves. I know I've gone into interviews before in the past, but I probably haven't done as much research as I should have. And I've definitely, one, I've not got the roles, and two, I've definitely felt worse for it. So I think the more you can do before, it is time consuming and you might not get the roles. So it is annoying, but I do think with every interview that you do learn something, either if it's how to do something well and right, or what not to do. You kind of have to have a few bad interviews, I think, to be able to know how to do a good one. So just see it as a learning opportunity. Even if you don't get the role, you'll get something out of it.
Yeah, definitely. Great advice. Yeah, and then I guess, first impression, but as Flora said, that first impression, it comes from your CV. So if you have a well-presented CV, if they like the look of you, they want to invite you in. So you've got to make sure that is all looking, as well as it can, for them to invite you in to get a face-to-face interview. But as I said, it's as soon as you walk into the building, be presentable, greet, people, be smiley and friendly. Also, if you're in the lift, it might sound silly, but you don't know who you're in the lift with. So, don't be on the phone sort of having conversations that you shouldn't. Just make sure that you're well presented. Sheena, do you have anything to add in terms of, how to set that first impression when you're going to a face-to-face interview?
I think you've probably touched on most of the things that I would look to do. I would add, if you're feeling anxious before going in or nervous, just take time to take a couple of really deep breaths, because that's really calming for you, and you'll be amazed how just something really simple like that can really help set you up before going into the interview room. I would say as well, which is what the others have already touched on, try and view it as something that's exciting. You know, if you can get your mindset in, this is a really good opportunity without putting loads of pressure on yourself. You know, you'll probably find that if you want to do well, but you don't want to put undue pressure on, because you'll come across really well if you can get your mindset that I'm really ready for this and I'm really excited about it, rather than I've got to do well, because that will come across. If you're a little bit more relaxed in yourself, that's going to come across to the interviewer.
Yeah, definitely. And I remember speaking to a student who a few weeks ago who was prepping for an interview, and they said, you know, they get really nervous. And I just think, look, as you said, Sheena, it's all about the experience. So even if, you know, what have you got to lose? If you get the role, then that's great. But if you don't, then, you know, you've experienced another face-to-face interview, and you can learn from that to then move on. So as you say, don't put that pressure on yourself. Great. So now moving on to the telephone interview, it'll be good to know actually, to the students that are on the line, has anyone ever experienced a telephone interview before? So Flora, I know you mentioned the process with Ed Broking as an example. You do the telephone interview. So where would that come in that application process? Would it be you see their CV and then you'd give them a telephone call? Where would that fit in?
Yeah, so we don't do the telephone process for every role, but it's definitely useful if we have a role that either we have lots of candidates for, and especially if we like the look of lots of them, as I said, and she's can take up a lot of time. You know, it's an hour per person, and if you've got a few people interviewing them, and obviously everyone's quite busy, a phone call is quite a good sort of check-in, just to see that the candidate's worth inviting in, which I know sounds terrible, but you know, it is right for the role. It's a good sort of initial chat to just see if they like the sound of the role, because obviously a job description is quite flat, so sometimes it's quite good to just talk through the actual reality of the role, and sometimes you'll find candidates thinking, oh, actually I thought it was different for whatever reason, and then you can both agree that they probably shouldn't come into interview. Or you often find, yeah, that people aren't right for the role. You know, CVs are one thing, but obviously how someone comes across and how someone talks about themselves is different. So often once you actually speak to someone, you can get a much better sense of a candidate is right. That's when we would normally use it. And obviously now, while we're in lockdown, all our interviewing is happening on the phone or through Zoom or video chat. So we're using it a lot more, obviously, currently, because we can't physically meet anyone. Yeah.
Of course. And I wonder, Flora, have you ever had a bad experience where you've left they didn't answer the phone and they had a voicemail that perhaps wasn't professional at all?
Do you know what? I haven't, but that's a good question. No, I haven't. I think these days most people just have what I always find people have just the automated one, which is obviously fine. But that is definitely something to think about. I think if someone did have a silly one, I think when I was younger, I definitely used to have silly ones like music in and stuff. People probably don't do that anymore. But no, I would think if I was applying for roles, I would make sure I had a professional voicemail with just my full name and a contact number, or an email address or something if they couldn't get through to me on obviously whatever number they'd called me on.
Yeah, great. So, you know, the do's and don'ts. So guys, if you do have a funny voicemail, make sure you do change it. If you don't want to record, I remember recording mine, it took me about 3 attempts, but if you don't want to record your own one, then just leave it. So a great tip there. Thanks, Flora. So in terms of, you know, the setup, PJ said that he has done a telephone interview and was a little bit nervous beforehand, which again, like with the face-to-face, you know, it's fine to have those nerves. So just make sure your phone is fully charged, you know, and they will give you a time. So, you know, so be by the phone at that time, and make sure you don't miss the call. I wonder, Flora, if you did, how many times would you try calling? So if they didn't answer first time, do you then drop them an email? Would you give them another call back? How would that work if they missed it?
I probably tried twice, and then I'd email them. Yeah, I think you don't want to be sending. I mean, it doesn't look great, and obviously I understand that things do crop up, so it's not always your fault if you can't get to the phone. But yeah, then I would always email. But I think you'd have to have quite a good excuse. Because as I said, if I'm recruiting for a role, I've blocked out quite a lot of time to do the interviews, which does take up quite a lot of time. And obviously it's not the only part of my role. So I do get quite annoyed. And again, that's just going to let you down if you could have had a really good interview. And then if I've got 2 great candidates, one annoyed me because they didn't, they messed me around by not answering the phone, and one didn't, I'd probably go for the person who didn't. So it's just a silly thing to sort of have against you.
Okay, yeah, no, great advice there, and so I guess that sort of ties into, the first impression. So don't set a bad impression by not answering the phone, but obviously, if you do have a valid reason why, then that's fine. And when you do answer the phone, speak clearly, like with how you would in a face-to-face interview. But obviously the plus side is when you're on the phone, they can't see you, so that's fine. You can be in your comfies, and you can have your notes at hand. So that will hopefully make you feel more confident because you can look at them at a glance. Great. So does anyone? We'll probably come into questions later. I'm conscious of time, so I'll move on to our video interview. And again, put in the chat box if you have ever done a video interview. Quite a few assessment centres are now going virtual with the current situation. So it'd be interesting to see if anyone has done one. And again, all those little basic steps which will help you be best prepared. So making sure that you have your laptop or PC set up, your Wi-Fi, it has a good connection. I haven't had the best Wi-Fi connection the last couple of days. So remember, we are all human and we have errors like that. So if for any reason you can't find the link or you can't get to the interview, then do let the employer know. Don't just forget about it and think, oh, that's my chance gone. Do get in touch with the employer. And again, look the part. So I guess a video interview would be like what you're seeing with me on this session now. So yes, you might not be able to see my bottom half, but still, dress something, that is presentable and comfortable, because it will also help you get into that mindset ready for your interview. And again, with, taking your time to to deliver your questions. So there's 2 types of video interviews. It might be live or it might be pre-recorded. So you might have someone the other end, or you might just be talking into, to a blank screen. So I would, have your eye line where the webcam is, so you're focused on something. And again, another plus with the video interviews is you can have your notes at hand. Make sure you're not, losing eye contact as you speak, but perhaps have some post-it notes on the wall so you can look at a quick glance when you are delivering your question. Sheena, do you have any perhaps advice that might help, any perhaps from your experience with video interviews in the past?
I'm very fortunate I've not had to do a video interview, which I'm very grateful for. It's one of those things, I can't see myself this time, but normally when I'm on a team chat call, we have our regular team meetings virtually. I hate seeing myself. So for me, that's something that I find really quite distracting. So I probably would have to really train myself to come across well in a video interview. But that being said, that aside, all the things that we've talked about for the face-to-face interview and the telephone interviews, they still hold the same. The fundamental thing is this is for you to show the interviewer who you are, and you can still do that as long as, I think the biggest thing for me, for somebody interviewing is the authenticity. You can learn new things. Nobody's going to look and expect you to know everything in the first interview. But if you come across as an engaged and authentic person, that really will come across in whatever means the interview is taking, whether it's face-to-face, telephone or video, that will come across. And that's the message you really want to get across. You're selling yourself here rather than trying to fit yourself into a role. So I think from that point of view, whatever medium the interview takes, those core things are going to be the same.
Definitely, thanks, Sheena. Yeah, great advice there. And I've got a story which some of you might have heard. I do tell this when I go in and see students. And there was a student who was doing a video interview, and he was dressed in a shirt and a tie and a blazer, but then behind him in the background he had his suit trousers hanging up. So, you know, it might sound funny and you think, oh, I probably won't do that, but just make sure those little things which, you know, have a clear background, make sure that, you know, you tell your family that you've got a video interview going on so that they don't interrupt you, and that will put your nerves at ease and make you deliver a great interview. So Ellie, I'm conscious of time. Yeah, we've covered everything there.
Yeah, some absolutely great advice. So thank you so much there. I'm just going to kind of whiz through these last sections which we wanted to add in here. So in terms of the application process then, so as we've heard, you know, Ed Broking don't do an assessment centre, but they do focus on the interviews. Some other employers might focus on the assessment centre and not focus so much on interviews. It does really vary. But regardless of that, when you're working through an application process, PJ, it looks like you've been recently through an application process. So here's a bit of an idea around what we'd recommend in terms of post-application and next steps. So really do kind of think about that follow-up side of things, and whether it's positive or negative, then it's really great to get any feedback from any employer that you might have gone through this process with. So often when it comes to the application process, if you've had a video or a phone interview or even assessment centre, you can by all means reach out to employers and ask for any feedback. Flora, I don't know if you get this often or if that's something that is part of your process, but how does that really work with you in terms of giving people who are applying to roles maybe feedback post the application?
Yeah, so it is something that we always try to do, because we understand, obviously, it's important and it's really helpful. And we've obviously applied for jobs before, so we know what it's like. Obviously, again, depending on how many people the company who you've applied for have hired, how many people they've interviewed, it can take a while to get feedback. So if they've interviewed, 10, 15 people, so I'd say be patient, because sometimes it's on my list, but it's maybe not at the top. But always ask. Most companies do it. As I said, everyone's sort of been there before, so people do like to do it.
Definitely, and I think it's all of these parts in our follow-up section is really use applications as a building block. So ask questions around to the employers around how it went. If appropriate, do kind of link with those fellow candidates on LinkedIn. We've heard some amazing stories at Pathway CTM of people kind of networking with other students at assessment centres and using them as contacts in the future. And do kind of self-evaluate. So that's what we've been talking about throughout this whole session, which is, you might not be successful in every single one of your applications, but every single one is really valuable in terms of learning a little bit more about yourself, about what things you do differently next time, about what things that you did really well in a particular kind of application process. So do use them as learning curves and building blocks, and rejection is definitely part of that. I mean, I can definitely speak for myself. I haven't been successful in every job application, but I'm very, very happy with where I am today. So every single kind of rejection you should try, albeit we know it's very difficult sometimes, but to really see them as a step towards where you might be in the future. So use them as motivation, and do remember that particularly at the moment things are potentially quite difficult around application processes, so really try not to be disheartened, and use them as kind of learning curves. So that's really important. But no, I am conscious of time. I know we have a couple of questions in the Q&A already, so I'm just going to get to this Q&A, and Mel Forrest has given us a good question, a good kind of question here. So from Mel, hi, great feedback on assessment centre prep, thank you. Has Pathway does Pathway have any employer updates on the new virtual assessment centre roles or tasks? This was covered briefly last week in another webinar. I just wondered if any employers had given more examples in the interim. So I guess that's around different ways that companies are transferring things online at the moment. I know lots of employers are going through that process at the moment, whether it's working through the logistics of whether it's Zoom or whether it's Google Teams or what kind of platforms they can use, Mel. So that's definitely something which is happening at the moment. When it comes to the actual tasks, it does really vary from employer to employer. I know that a few of our employer partners work with kind of psychometric tests, which they're doing online, which is really kind of, we can send you some examples of. So Mel, if you do want to email us afterwards, we can send you some examples to give you an idea around what they consist of. But when it comes to the kind of assessment centre tasks, then just, I would say, log into our session tomorrow and log into the session next Tuesday, because we are running example assessment centres tasks, problem solving kind of sessions every Tuesday. So if you are keen to get an idea of what employers are testing at the moment online, then that'll be my place to go if I were you, Mel. Great. So Catherine, I don't know if you want to go for the next question.
Yeah, so someone has asked, why do employers use group activities, which is a really good question. Flora, would you have anything to say as to why employers might use group activities?
Yeah, so we don't do that, but I've been in situations before where I've had group interviews, and essentially I think that's just so they can see how you interact with other people. It's often how you talk with other people. It's slightly more relaxed. I do think it's probably a better way to sort of see how you are and how you might be in the workplace, whereas obviously interviews, where there's just you and often, you know, two people interviewing you, is a much more formal process, and someone doesn't necessarily come across as how they would every day. So obviously, as relaxed as you can try and make an interview seem, obviously there is that interview feeling about it. So I do think group interviews are a good way to sort of see how someone is when they're, you know, slightly less stressed, slightly less nervous, and just see how they interact with people and how they, you know, teamwork and how confident they are and how assured of themselves they are, and all the things that you're sort of looking for in a candidate.
That's great. No, that's exactly and exactly what we were kind of talking about earlier around the group task. So that's one to bear in mind, students, if you do get to the kind of group task stage. So someone just mentioned in the Q&A box around the practice psychometric testing, and yes, that is something that we can provide to you. So we'll definitely send that on. So we'll be providing the email address for Pathway CTM if you don't have it already at the end of the session as a follow-up, and you can email us and we'll get back to you with that kind of link for some examples. So don't worry, we'll be able to kind of set you up there. So in terms of kind of the rest of the session, just with those last questions being wrapped up, I just wanted to maybe finish off Sheena and Flora in terms of, you've given us some amazing tips already, so I'm sorry if this is kind of maybe you've given us lots already, but are there any kind of, looking back on maybe your 16 to 18-year-old selves, whether it's specifically for the application process, or maybe just in general, is there any advice you'd give to your younger self in the current climate, when you might be thinking about applying to various things? Anything more general around pieces of advice for young people about to venture into the world of work and applications? I'm going to go to you first, Sheena.
I think one of the things that maybe we didn't touch on with the interviews, which is always a good thing to have, and it ties in with the research, have some questions for yourself to ask. I think, you know, there's nothing worse than at the end of an interview you saying, you know, as the interviewer, so is there anything you'd like to know? And the interviewee sitting there saying no, because that's not going to come across as engaged. So I would say, just, it doesn't have to be a deep and meaningful question, but just have something that you can ask, you know, to show you've paid attention to what's been discussed in the interview. You know, try, and if you think, oh, that's a really good point, you can ask something to expand more on it. So that would be something I would say. And there's lots of opportunities. I guess, you know, you'll be very, very lucky if the first interview you do is successful. It might be, and that's fantastic if it is. But if it's not, you know, there are other opportunities, and that one probably wasn't the right one for you. So when you do get the success, it will be more what's right for you, I hope.
No, absolutely, and that's such a good piece of advice. I always think have a couple of questions up your sleeve throughout the whole of an interview, because well, I don't know about, but I definitely feel like, you know, keeping the conversation flowing, and when you're asked the questions, having a few is very important. So thank you. And then I guess, Flora, just finally from you before we move into the kind of wrap up from the session, is there anything else you feel like you'd advice you'd give?
I feel like Sheena's taken all the good advice. No, I definitely agree. Always have questions. I hate when I get to the end of an interview and someone just looks at you. Even if you just say, I did have some questions and actually you've answered them all with all of your information. Like, if you panic, I would just say that, because sometimes, you know, your interviewer might have actually just been great and sort of given you all of the information that you needed. But at least then acknowledge that, because then it looks like you have been thinking. It probably just sounds really cheesy, but just believe in yourself. I think probably if I was talking to my 18-year-old self, I'd say, you know, you can't get any jobs that you don't apply for. So I would just, if you see something and you think it sounds like you're excited by it, or you can see yourself doing it, I would just apply, and they can only say no. I think the more the more you send out and put out there, it's all experience. It will all help, even if you just have an interview and it doesn't go anywhere. Just apply for what you're interested in and go from there. I think lots of people tend to see job descriptions or job listings and think, oh, well, I can't do that, so I won't even bother. But you don't know. Often job descriptions have loads of information because we have to put it on there, and actually we just want the right candidate who's really positive and is really keen on learning. So actually that's often what's most important, and if you can do that, then I definitely apply.
No, definitely, and I think that's such a nice kind of note to kind of end on, then, maybe, in terms of like that motivation and having the right attitude. I mean, every single student that's joined this session today, I think that's one thing we can be sure on, is that they do have the right attitude if you're joining our sessions at 2 p.m. every day. So well done, students, you're one step ahead of those other people who are applying. Bearing that in mind then, and coming to the end of the session, what we always love to see is if you do have any kind of messages for us about today's session, if you found it useful, if there were things you maybe wanted to find out a little bit more about, then pop them in the chat box now, or even if it's just any kind of note that you have for us, then do go ahead and put it in the chat box, because it's always good for us to hear a little bit of feedback. So just while I do kind of the wrap up and next steps, and if you want to put anything in there, then go ahead and do so. We love to see that. So I mentioned briefly in the question, one of the answers to one of the questions is that if you do have any questions for us, we will follow up with every single student that's been on the line today with the recording of today's session, because there's been so many useful tips on it from Ed Broking, so thank you for that. But if there's anything in the meantime before you get that follow-up email with the recording from today and a little survey, then just pop us an email at student@pathwayctm.com. I know a couple of people were asking around those test links, so we can definitely send those through to you. So just put your name in there and the fact you were on today's session, and we'll be able to get that back to you. Equally, we are continuing the conversation today via Instagram. So if you haven't already kind of followed us, then do follow us at Pathway CTM on Instagram. And we'll be kind of getting a bit of feedback on our Instagram stories around today's session and around any elements of it that we can kind of help support you on a bit more. It's really nice to see the really positive feedback coming in the chat box. So PJ found the session really inspiring. Great session from Luke, and Mel thanking you for your time. So I don't think, as much as it is us, Catherine, I'm not taking it away from us, but I think largely we want to take a thank you here to Sheena and Flora for giving us your top tips, because it's so nice to hear directly from kind of people in the company we work with around your experiences and advice. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate the time taken, and thank you so much for the students for joining us as well, because we love doing these sessions and we love helping kind of talk you through things that might be helpful for your future. Have a lovely rest of the day, everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck, everyone.